Next up on City Corner is a special feature about Chouteau's Landing. I'm Sarah Bernard. Stay with us. Welcome back to City Corner. I'm Sarah Bernard, and today we have a special guest with us, photographer Richard Sprengeler, who has photographed multiple historical sites and activities around the St. Louis region. And he's here today to tell us about his latest project and so much more. So welcome, Rich, to City Corner. We're glad to have you back here at STL TV.
Thank you for having me.
So I know we have a lot to talk about your latest project, which is Chouteau's Landing, and all about the redevelopment of that area and how you have documented it. But before we go there, let's talk a little bit about you and your career as a photographer and how you got started. So tell us a little bit about your history.
I got into photography through music, believe it or not. In high school, I played the trombone. And when I graduated, my father had been in the Navy and my older brother had been in the Navy, and I wanted to travel. So I had the idea to audition for the Navy music program, and I passed. And my second duty station was Naples, Italy, and I spent 2 years touring Europe in a jazz rock band.
Interesting.
And I had this little Kodak Instamatic camera with little flash cubes on top.
So take us back to what year this was, because we all remember those flash bulbs.
See if I can count back that far.
Are we talking like the
1974?
I was going to say 70s. Okay.
Yeah, 1974, I graduated from high school. So my last 2 years were spent in Europe, and I had this little tiny Instamatic camera, and I wasn't real pleased with the photographs. And a member of the band was an amateur photographer, and he recommended that I get a good 35 millimeter camera and start shooting slides. So I did that, and I started sending the slides of the European cities I've been traveling to back home. My mother was an artist. She was an organist and a painter and a ceramicist, and she said, "You know, you've got a pretty good eye. You should take a photography class when you get out of the Navy." So I did. I came back to Fairview Heights, where I grew up, and I took 4 semesters of black and white photography at the local community college, and then I enrolled in the photography program at SIU Carbondale, and I graduated in 1982 with a bachelor's degree in fine art photography.
Okay, so what happened to music along the way? Did music go by the wayside?
I played up until about 3 or 4 years ago. I kept playing.
Okay, so ours obviously were in your family, a part of how you grew up. So what do you think drew you to photography? Was it your mom who influenced that and your friend?
My mother suggested that I take a photography class. When I took that class, like so many photographers of my generation, the first time you're in the darkroom and you see this print magically appear off of a white piece of paper, it was just mesmerizing.
Yeah.
And I was hooked when I saw my first print come up.
Yeah. So, and you were talked for a moment ago about using slides. So that was a big thing back then. Was taking slides as opposed to the prints. And then, did you print from the slides, or tell me a little bit about why the slides were important?
They were important because, well, having a slideshow is really nice.
Yeah.
You darken the room and you project the slides up onto the wall, and it's cheaper. You don't have to pay for the printing.
Okay, yeah, and that makes sense. And now, I mean, everything's changed with videos and digital photography and that kind of thing. So this was the early intro, I guess, to what we have today, was the slides and slideshows.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So historical area. So you have, over your career, focused somewhat on photographing history. Mm-hmm. Did that start from the work that you did in Europe?
I believe so. For 2 years I traveled. I went to Paris 4 times and all over Europe, North Africa, and architecture is the main thing of the photographs that I have. Of course, there was people in the photographs, but I was photographing architecture. So at the very beginning, I was seeing architecture and learning how to photograph it. And it just, my father was a mathematician, and I never took to math, but I liked geometry. And architecture is all about geometry and organizing geometry into a coherent composition that makes sense. So architecture just kind of, I just loved doing it.
Did you find that architecture in historical areas, that you drew inspiration from them in some way? And if so, what would that be?
The inspiration comes from the very early history of photography. In the mid-1800s, the old Paris was being torn down, and the French government hired photographers, one in particular, Charles Marville, that I'm really fond of, and they were hired to document the city before it disappeared. And then later on, Eugene Atget photographed old Paris also. So,
And that was just the very beginning of photography.
very beginning of photography. Photography kind of was, 1839 is considered the beginning of photography.
Wow, so this was around 1850?
1850, yeah.
Okay, very interesting. And why do you think it was important for them to document Paris before it was reconstructed?
Without images, there's nothing. You know, you could just talk about it.
So
You
those
can't
are
see
really
it.
one of the first historical images we have then, are from Paris.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very
One of the first photographs from Paris, I believe, was a street scene taken from above, and it was a long exposure of many minutes, and all the people and all the carriages and all the horses blended out, and you couldn't see them, except for a guy getting a shoe shine. He was standing still for several minutes getting a shoe shine. So he's the first person that ever showed up in a photograph.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, and we can learn so much. We learn so much from paintings of years gone by, and photography just changed everything because it was the actual moment in time.
And there is a program in the government where if any historic building is being torn down, it has to be documented with the photography. I've done several things in the St. Louis area of buildings coming down, and they needed to be documented.
So you've been hired by the government or the city. Okay, interesting. So let's talk a little bit about your equipment and how it's changed over these years. So starting with the flash bulb, the Instamatic Kodak back in the 70s. Do you still use historical equipment?
I do. We'll have a photograph of my equipment coming up soon. I use the classic view camera from the 1800s, in particular an 8x10-inch view camera and a 4x5-inch view camera. And the 8x10 and the 4x5 refer to the size of film that you shoot. So the back of the 8x10 is like ground glass that's 8x10 inches, and so you see this huge image, and there's the view camera on the right side. And so you see this huge 8x10-inch image, and that helps me compose photographs better because the image is so small. I do a lot of digital, but looking through the little tiny hole, a little tiny image is not the same as seeing an 8x10-inch image on the ground glass.
So this equipment that we just saw on our screen, is it new version of old equipment, or is it
Correct.
actually? Okay.
Correct. The view cameras are about 30 years old that I have.
Okay, so they're still being made.
Still being made. The
But-
same design as 150 years ago. If it's not broke, don't fix it.
That's amazing. Yeah, so because camera equipment and photography equipment has evolved so much over these 150 plus years since photography started.
Yeah, the equipment, the camera is basically the same, but the quality of the lenses is exceptional now. That's the big difference.
Okay.
Is the lens quality.
So do you when using that style of equipment, do you have to make adjustments in any way to make that photo more appealing to the eye today?
Absolutely, especially with architecture. We're all familiar with newspaper photographs of buildings where you look up at the building and the building is going like this.
Yeah.
With a view camera, you can get a picture of an entire building by exactly leveling the camera so it's not pointing up. And the lens board on these view cameras then can rise up. So you raise the lens up to get the whole building in the picture, and the lines are straight. That's why professional architectural photographers, ever since the 1850s, have used view cameras because they can keep the building straight.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what are some challenges that you face using that style of equipment?
It's heavy. You have to carry it. It's slow. It takes a while to set the photographs up. And it's very difficult to photograph anything in motion. They're not used for sports. you know,
Okay.
because you have to put a dark cloth over your head to look at the image. And then when it's ready, you take the dark cloth off, you close the lens, you put the film in, you set the lens for the aperture and the shutter speed, you pull out the dark slide. That all takes a lot of time. And if something is moving, your camera's not even pointed at it anymore. So it's more for static subjects, and architecture and landscape work are the two subject matters that photographers use view cameras the most.
And finding the film is not a problem?
Not yet. A lot of films have been discontinued, but the films that I use, my black and white films, are still being produced, but they're getting more and more expensive
Yeah.
because not many people are buying it. So,
Is there like a special association or club of photographers like you that use that equipment? There must be some kind of interaction.
there's camera clubs in St. Louis. The St. Louis Camera Club is one of the oldest ones in the country. I'm a curator at the International Photography Hall of Fame that is now in St. Louis. And so there's a group of photographers there that both use view cameras and use digital.
Interesting. Do you still develop your own?
I do. The black and white negatives from my view cameras have to be developed in the darkroom.
Yeah.
About 4 years ago, I converted over to digital printing instead of printing in my darkroom. So I developed the negatives, and then I scan them with a scanner, work on them in Photoshop, and then I print them on a large format digital printer that I bought at home.
Do you do all of your own printing, or developing, or do you send some of it out?
I do all of my own printing and developing, unless something really, really large is ordered. My printer can make a print 22 by 40 feet.
Oh, wow.
22
What?
inches.
Really?
That's never going to happen, you know.
Yeah.
Usually it's 22 by 28 or whatever the photograph is. But a number of years ago, a doctor in Germany saw a print at the airport when I had an exhibit there, and he wanted a 4 by 5 foot print. And so I had Robert Boulevard's lab in town. He's the best printer in the town. And so I had Robert make me a 4 by 5 foot print.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, we're going to take a break, but when we come back, we're going to focus on Chouteau's Landing, because that is one of your most recent projects, and it's very important for us here in St. Louis to know a little bit more about what's coming and what's in the past that you documented. So we'll be right back with more of that in just a few minutes. Thanks for staying with us.
Did you know that you can watch STL TV on your smart TV? That's right. With the new STL TV Now app, you can watch STL TV at home without a cable subscription. And that includes our live broadcast channel as well as video on demand content. We have apps for Apple TV, Fire TV, and Roku. You probably have at least one of those at home, right? But this one is a Fire TV. Now listen, it is really easy to get started. Just find the App Store on your TV, then search for STL TV Now. Select it and click to install. And in just a few seconds, you are enjoying STL TV's great programming such as City Corner, Inside Sports, City Government, and public interest coverage. Or, my personal favorite, In the Kitchen.
When I was 10, my mom got deported. We had a difficult time, and I feel that's why I didn't get to finish school. My husband is really supportive in a way that he pushed me to go back to school.
She wants to have a career so her kids can look up to her.
They both keep me motivated to go to school, and they see that if I do it, like they can do it too, you know? I feel that everything's possible.
Find free adult education classes near you at finishyourdiploma.org.
Where's your emergency?
Everyone's on their way. What happened?
Your friend's not breathing.
She's dead? Yes, please get my mom and dad. Oh my God!
If you need to do something to feel okay to drive, you're not okay to drive. Don't drive buzzed.
Welcome back to City Corner. I am Sarah Bernard, and we are talking to Rich Sprengeler, who is a photographer here in the St. Louis area, who's focused a lot on historical documentation of buildings and architecture and that kind of thing in St. Louis. So we, in the last segment, we were talking a lot about the equipment you use and really interesting about the use of some of the old camera styles from days gone by, and it's still very important and useful to you. Let's talk about now Chouteau's Landing, which is one of your latest projects, and it's an area of St. Louis. Do you want to tell us a little bit about where exactly Chouteau's Landing is?
Yeah, Chouteau's Landing is a 12-block area, and it is on the riverfront just south of the Poplar Street Bridge. So the Poplar Street Bridge marks the northern part of the Chouteau's Landing, and then it continues down south. There's no really landmark for the southern part of it, but it's 12 blocks, and then it's the river, and then Interstate 55 is the east and west boundaries of it.
Okay, and that area is a lot of warehouses and old factories and things like that, is that correct?
Mostly abandoned.
Mostly abandoned, okay.
And some of the buildings have been abandoned long enough that they'll have to come down, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, and it's going to be redeveloped by the city of St. Louis into an entertainment
It'll
district?
It'll be a commercial industrial area. It'll be an entertainment area, restaurants. I believe they have plans for a green space and reinvigorating the actual port itself. The Chouteau's Landing used to be a port where the barges were loaded and unloaded, and that hasn't happened in 30 years. And there's plans in this rendering coming up that shows the new port that's going to be there.
Interesting. So were you hired to shoot the area, or was this something that you took on yourself creatively?
I took it on myself creatively. I told a friend of mine that I had wandered down to Chouteau's Landing, and he said, I just read an article in the news, St. Louis Business Journal, announcing that Chouteau's Landing is going to be redeveloped in the next couple of years. And that alarm bells went off,
Okay.
Disappearing space, I better photograph it.
Yeah, and going back to what you were telling us about Paris in the 1850s and how it was documented before the rebuilding there occurred. So you know the importance of documenting these old buildings and the architecture and that kind of thing that inspires you.
Right.
So, when you then decided to photograph, when you approach a new location like Chouteau's Landing, how do you start? How do you know where to shoot, what to shoot, and how much of what you did encompassed the entire area or just parts of it?
I photographed the entire area. When I approach an area to photograph, particularly with architecture, I'm looking for geometry. I'm looking for lines, squares, rectangles, circles, and to find significant form and simplify it. Photographing cities is a kind of a eclectic, jumbled mass of shapes, and you have to isolate compositions and simplify them into their most basic forms in order for the photograph to work, as opposed to just being all sorts of things.
So, from the standpoint of what the eye can capture, is that what you're saying? So when we, as a viewer, looks at a photograph, we have to make sense of that photograph. So is that what you're thinking about as a photographer?
Yeah, I'm thinking of simplifying the photograph into larger shapes that balance each other and make sense, and convey the amount of information that I want the photograph to convey. Sometimes that means getting close, sometimes it's moving back and using a wide-angle lens. When I first started, I only had a long lens and I was doing a lot of close-ups. But as I gained experience with all of the lenses, I learned to move back and do wide-angle shots too. So I do a little bit of everything, a lot of details and a lot of wide-angle shots.
So give us a scope of what this entails. How many days or weeks were you there? How many photographs did you capture?
I've been photographing Chouteau's Landing for over 40 years, but never as a project where I told myself, I'm going to do Chouteau's Landing as a project. But, I'd go out and go, where am I going to go today? And I'd go, I'll wander down to Chouteau's Landing. But 2 years ago, when I found out that it was going to be redeveloped, that's when I decided I need to focus on this exclusively, because the clock is ticking. And over the last 2 years that I've been photographing it, things are disappearing. Like the vehicle deck to the the MacArthur Bridge has been torn down. So, and a lot of the trash, unfortunately, urban spaces that are abandoned turn into garbage dumps. And there was a large area of a number of acres that just got filled up with trash. And in the last year, that's been cleaned up. And there was a cement plant there that I had photographed a lot of, and that's been taken down in the last 3 or 4 months. And so it's in the cleaning up and tearing down of things that can't be used phase, and then the reconstruction is going to start after that.
So I'm curious if you feel that you have an emotional attachment to these buildings. How do you feel when you photograph them and then at some point they're torn down?
It's a loss. It really is. Many times I'll photograph the same scene over and over and over again over many, many, many years. And so the loss of subject matter is always disappointing.
And you said you've been photographing Chouteau's Landing for 40 years.
I first wandered down there in 1980 when I was in school. Yeah.
So what drew you to that area? The architecture?
The architecture and the gritty urban decay feel to the whole place. Interestingly enough, even now, I see portrait photographers down there all the time doing portraits of people.
Oh,
with
interesting.
the background of the old bricks,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. There's video photographers down there doing music videos. It's quite a mecca for video photographers and photographers.
Yeah, so it's there. Well, we still have a lot of areas of St. Louis that have that appearance, I would say, that look.
Unfortunately, we do.
But it's nice that people have found the art and the beauty in that to use it as backdrop for videos and portraits and that kind of thing too.
Right. There's a term that's come up in the last 20 years called ruin porn.
What is it called?
Ruin porn.
Ruin porn, okay.
Ruin porn, photographing old buildings. There's just something charming and interesting about the subject matter.
Well, and it goes back to your days in Europe,
Sure.
where literal ruins, literal buildings that are thousands of years old are still standing and maybe falling down to a certain extent, but there's so much beauty there, and people recognize that and want to keep that going. So you, over the course of your career, you've had some notable historical documentation of photographs. What are some of your favorite places that you have photographed?
The very first project that I took that was documenting disappearing architecture was the aftermath of the flood of '93. For 2 years, from '93 through '94 and '95, I photographed the aftermath of it. I had a newborn child in '92, so I wasn't able to photograph the flood itself. But starting in '93, I was able to have some time off, and I spent 2 years photographing the aftermath. And St. Louis itself didn't get flooded because of the levees, but the city of Valmeyer in Illinois was completely flooded. And so I photographed Valmeyer quite a bit. Portions of St. Genevieve that were on the wet side of the levee were flooded, and the island, Chouteau's Island up north, where 270 goes across the Mississippi River. There was a village on Chouteau's Island, that I photographed for 2 years.
And that was a really important, I mean, when you say the flood of 93, yeah, anyone who was here in St. Louis at that time remembers that, the flood of the Mississippi. How do you know, and maybe this is an impossible question to answer, but how do you know when you're done at a location?
I always run into the problem of not finding any new photographs. And I suspect I'm done when that happens. And what I generally do is I back off from the project for a week, 2 weeks, a month sometimes, and then I come back to it. And many times when I come back, I'll start to find things. You're looking, your mindset is different, and you literally, since you've been doing other things, you're a different photographer coming back to it. So I generally find things coming back to it. But if I don't find things when I come back to it, I know that it's over.
So you know when that moment is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And have you gotten to that point at Chouteau's Landing?
I'm pretty close, yeah. I'm kind of winding up the Chouteau's Landing project, and I'm working on photographing rural scenes right now as my new project, traveling around Missouri and Illinois.
Interesting. And how do you find those locations?
You just drive.
You just
get in the
drive.
car. I get the map out, and I find the little tiny roads that have little towns on them. There's always things in small towns. Small towns are suffering economically, and so a lot of them have closed storefronts, and there's a lot of decay in the small towns, which is bad for the towns, great for photography.
That's right. And do you have a name for that project?
Rural scenes.
Rural
yeah,
scenes.
it's on my website.
Is it mostly going to be Missouri, or will there be some Illinois as well?
I've been mostly in Illinois, but I'm going to start doing Missouri also.
And how do you feel that this work that you do honors or preserves the history of these locations that you're shooting?
I think within our lifetime, we will witness the demise of the small farm. More and more and more farms are being bought up and being run by large conglomerates. And there's just something about the old red barns and the rural houses next to them that it's Americana, apple pie,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And the Midwest is the perfect setting for that. So to wrap up, tell us, let our viewers know where they can see your photographs of the rural scenes and Chouteau's Landing and all of your other work.
I have a website, and it's simply richardspengler.com.
Okay.
Yeah, and on it, I have over probably 20 different categories of photographs I've worked on. Some photographers work on one subject matter, and that's all they do, but I love to do everything. So if you go to the website, you'll see a lot of different types of work.
Wonderful. It sounds like you're ever evolving and always inspired. So we'll be sure to keep an eye to see what's next after Rural Scenes. So Richard, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, our viewers, for joining us for another episode of City Corner. We're always bringing you the latest inspiration, the things happening around our city. And we appreciate you joining in with us on that as well. So keep it tuned in to stltv.net and watch us on Facebook and keep coming back. Rich, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, we can just keep chatting a little bit.